Eventually, you want to get your scales at 144 at 4 notes to the beat, as follows. Then when you come to a fast scale passage in a piece of music, it won't be difficult for you. You'll already be able to do it. Which should you learn first, scales or arpeggios? You know, I've got a lot of videos on working on scales and arpeggios, which you can find in the description. First, just a very brief primer on what each of these is. And one of them, scales, is just a series of whole steps and half steps. All whole steps except between the 3rd and 4th and 7th and 8th notes. There are only 8 notes in a major scale, and the first and last note are the same. And I'm sure you're familiar with major scales. That's a C major scale. Between the 3rd and 4th notes, there's no black keys because that's the way the piano keyboard is built, and between B and C. Arpeggios are simply broken chords. But when you really master all major and minor scales and arpeggios, it enables you to have fluidity in music, and it makes learning music easier, and it helps your technique enormously to have all your scales right under your fingertips. And arpeggios. So, which one should you learn how to do first? And it's not so simple, so let me break it down for you. At the very beginning, you want to start with scales. Why? Well, both scales and arpeggios involve the crossing of fingers and crossing of thumbs. And since your hands are reversed, what the left hand does going up, the right hand does going down, and what the right hand does going up, the left hand does going down. Let me show you very simply. If you're playing a major scale, you're going to run out of fingers, right? So you cross under the thumb. On and on up the scale. Notice how the thumb prepares early. Practicing scales slowly is key to developing the speed and fluency. We'll get to that in a minute. I just want to show you the left hand has 3rd and 4th finger crossings going up. And coming down, it's reversed. The right hand has the 3rd and 4th finger crossings. And left hand has the thumb crossings. So why would you start with scales rather than arpeggios? There's so many more notes in a scale, you'd think that maybe arpeggios would be a little bit easier. But the reason is the crossing of the fingers, particularly the thumb, is so far with arpeggios compared to scales. Watch with a C major scale. The 3rd and 4th fingers are right next to each other. The keys are right next to each other. Whereas an arpeggio, look how far that is from G to C. So indeed, starting with scales is the way to go. However, you don't necessarily want to just work on all your scales and then first start arpeggios. I think perhaps a good way to go is learn all the major scales and then start introducing arpeggios as you continue on to your minor scales. That way you start to get the sense of what arpeggios are like. Now, I mentioned the use of the metronome. You notice it's right here. Scales, a good starting point might be 60. You really ideally want to get your scales at 4 notes to the beat at 72. But you start very slowly at 1 note to the beat. And I can come down as well. Notice the power that's coming just from the fingers. Now you might be tempted to do this. You get a lot of power by leading the arms, but the reason why that doesn't work is if you try to go fast doing that, you'll never be able to gain speed. So that's why when playing slowly, let all the power come from the fingers and make the fingers distinct from one another. So the fingers that are previously played are out of the way. It's the release of those fingers that's so important. So after you've gone one note to the beat, then you go two notes to the beat. Look at my left-hand thumb. Always under, except when it's playing. That's what enables the speed, so you can go four notes to the beat, lightening up and staying closer to the keys. And you should do that many times so you get comfortable. And I would suggest, after you get the C major scale, go in the order of the sharps to G major, up a fifth, then D major, then A major, and go through all the sharp scales, then go through the flat scales, learn all the major scales, then introduce arpeggios. And you can alternate. If arpeggios are coming okay for you, go through a few, and then you can start doing your minor scales concurrently. Eventually, you want to learn all the major scales and minor scales at 72, four notes to the beat, all the arpeggios at 60. It's harder to play the arpeggios quite as quickly, so you'll always be a little bit slower. Once you have all your scales and arpeggios, are you done? No, that's just the beginning, because then you go back and you try to get them all a little bit faster. And each time you go through all the scales and arpeggios, you can take weeks or months to do that. There's no rush. Pick one each day and make it interesting for yourself. Eventually, you'll know all of them, and you'll be able to increase the speed little by little. Ideally, getting up to 120 four notes to the beat for arpeggios, 144 four notes to the beat for scales. If you've got that, you've got a good foundation of technique on the piano. But just learning scales, if you can learn all of them, fantastic. It makes reading music easier, learning music easier, and you'll have more technique, not just for scales running up and down, but all finger work, because you will have the abstraction of this technique of scales and arpeggios literally at your fingertips. So even if you don't learn all of them, don't worry about learning all of them. Just take one a week. Eventually you will learn all of them. There's no rush. Just make it a part of your daily practice. 5 or 10 minutes a day will go a long way over the course of a year if you practice on a regular basis. Well, why are they important? What's so important about practicing scales and arpeggios? After all, there's so much music to be practiced. Why should you spend time with something like scales and arpeggios? Well, that's a great question. I'm going to answer that question first, so you have a reason for even watching this show in the first place. Scales and arpeggios are kind of like if you wanted to be a mathematician or do math, you'd want to first learn your addition, subtraction, multiplication, and addition tables, or else how could you possibly do math? It's kind of the same thing with music. Major and minor tonality is prevalent in virtually all forms of Western music, and you want to have scales and broken chords just a part of your technique and a part of your mind so you understand music intrinsically. Plus, it gives an opportunity to work on just that type of technique, that is, finger technique, without regards to rhythm, expression, phrasing, or any of the myriad things that pieces of music have. So you can focus just on that, as well as being an excellent way to warm up for your daily practice, so you don't injure yourself starting with something really hard. Scales, particularly slow scales, are a great warm-up. So, now scales. The first thing you want to do is get a book. There's a great resource for pianists called 60 Selected Studies by Hanon, H-O-N-O-N. You must get it if you don't have it already. It has all the scales and arpeggios with the fingering. Get the complete, Hanon Complete. It's got everything you need in there. There's also exercises in there that are a good foundation to develop enough strength to be able to study scales in the first place. So if you're a beginner, maybe you shouldn't start with scales. Start with some of the easier exercises that don't have any fingering crossings, and they're an easy way to develop strength in preparation for scales. Well, scales should really be practiced slowly. It's very important to practice scales slowly. And when you practice scales, the first thing that's going to occur to you is having to learn the fingering. And of course, we only have 10 fingers, but the scales go up and down the whole keyboard. First, what is a scale? Simply put, a scale is a series of whole steps and half steps. And in the case of harmonic minor, there's even a step and a half in there. So the first and last note are the same, and generally you play through all the octaves on the keyboard. Arpeggios are simply broken chords. These are intrinsic techniques that are found in music, and music is structured on them as well. So slow practice is so important. Why is slow practice so important? Well, just like a dancer or someone doing yoga exercises, that slow exercise builds strength and flexibility. It's the same thing with piano. You want to develop the flexibility of your fingers and the strength. Much like if you were to kick your leg, it would be pretty easy to kick it up high. But if you try to lift your leg up very slowly, it takes much more strength to do that. It's the same thing with piano. It takes more strength to play slowly. Plus, it's very important to play with raised fingers, so you delineate the notes that are down and you practice the release of notes so the note lengths are all consistent from note to note. So, I'm going to show you how to practice scales. You should have a metronome. Put the metronome on 60 and play one note to the beat. Now, you have finger crossings. In the right hand going up, you have thumb crossings, and in the left hand, you have third and fourth finger crossings. Coming down, it's just the reverse. The right hand has the third and fourth finger crossings, and the left hand has thumb crossings, because of course, the hands are mirror images of one another. So you may have to practice hands separately just to learn the fingerings, and I'd suggest starting with a C major or G major scale and get the fingering learned. You really need to memorize. Basically, there's just 4 fingerings going up and 4 fingerings going down you have to memorize. Those are the crossings that I spoke of just a moment ago. Once you have the fingerings learned, then you can begin to practice your scale. Put the metronome on 60 and play slowly, and watch your hands that you avoid arm motion and do everything just with the powerful fingers. And you should do a full 4 octaves, just like it says in Hanon, all the way up and all the way down. Comfortably. Make sure that you use the power of the fingers and do not use the arms, because the arms can't go fast enough. So you want to just use the fingers in the slow practice. You'll get tremendous benefit from the slow practice. You should play it at least 4 times through satisfactorily, where you're comfortable, the notes are clean, your hand position is good. Then go on to 2 notes to the beat with a metronome. Once again, make sure it's comfortable and clean. Go all the way up and down the keyboard 4 times. Then attempt 4 notes to the beat. Now here's where you may have some difficulty, so I suggest find a speed that you can do 4 notes to the beat, even if it's dramatically slower. Get comfortable with that, and then once you're comfortable, raise it a notch. And every time you get it successfully, raise it a notch until you are up to 60 at 4 notes to the beat. You could even put it at 60 at 2 notes to the beat and start going a notch or 2 at a time to work up to 120 at 2 notes to the beat, which is the same at 60 at 4 notes to the beat. So these are ways to work on scales. Now, the raised fingers goes for 1 note to the beat and 2 notes to the beat. When you go to 4 notes to the beat, because it's faster, there isn't time to raise fingers. In fact, you want to lighten up your technique so that you can play with fluidity all the way up and all the way down the piano. And you should be able to play 4 notes to the beat many times, not just 4 times. Be able to be comfortable playing up and down the scale. Now, there are other ways to work on scales as well. Once you master your scales, first of all, you want to learn all your major and minor scales and arpeggios. That is kind of a prerequisite for anybody who's serious about classical piano. Even in jazz, it's helpful. In other forms of music, I would suggest learning all your major and minor scales and arpeggios. In fact, a lot of jazz players will learn diminished scales, blues scales. There's many other types of scales. You can learn your modes. There's no end to what you can do. Some of the things you can do is learn your scales in sixths, tenths, and thirds. You can also play your scales in contrary motion. There's a world to discover in scales. What I suggest is use them as a daily warm-up. Spend just 10 minutes a day on scales, and before you know it, by the end of the year, if you do one a week, you'll have all your scales and arpeggios in your back pocket. Then you could start increasing the speed little by little. Eventually, you want to get your scales at 144 at 4 notes to the beat, as follows. That's a good minimal tempo for a virtuoso technique, 144 at 4 notes to the beat. You should strive for that and hopefully get that even faster than that someday. Then when you come to a fast scale passage in a piece of music, it won't be difficult for you. You'll already be able to do it. Plus, you'll find benefits in all your playing. So try working on scales and see how it helps your technique in piano playing. 3 ways to practice arpeggios. Just for everyone, arpeggios are simply broken chords. Scales and arpeggios form the foundation of technique, not just for the piano, but for virtually all musical instruments. I've talked about how to practice scales and arpeggios in the past. Today I'm going to give you 3 ways of practicing arpeggios specifically. Now, if you like this, I could probably give you 3 more or maybe even 10 more because there's many ways of practicing arpeggios, but I'm going to give you 3 good starters for you. Okay, broken chord. So I'm just going to take a C major arpeggio to keep it simple. Arpeggio, a broken C major chord. That's the foundation of an arpeggio. But of course, since you're going all the way up and down the keyboard with both hands, you need finger crossings. I suggest Hannon, 60 Selected Studies for the Virtuoso Pianist, is a resource of all the fingering for all your major and minor scales and arpeggios, as well as exercises and other things. So the first way to practice arpeggios is perhaps the most fundamental, and I've talked about this before in videos, and I'm going to recap this because it's so important and essential, which is simply to practice slowly, first with independence of the fingers, and as you get faster, make the fingers closer to the keys to get speed and lightness. I'll demonstrate this. And you want to use the metronome when practicing arpeggios or scales because the whole idea is to measure your playing because you want to have precision. You want to be able to play with evenness in tone and touch and timing and phrasing and everything. And of course, you can practice your arpeggios with different phrasing and dynamics and all of that. But for now, I'm just going to play them straight through at kind of a strong level. Always from the fingers. It won't do you any good to practice arpeggios or scales using your arms, your wrists, because as you go faster, they're not going to be able to keep up. Your fingers, the whole idea is to develop your fingers. So watch how you can practice arpeggios slowly. If you're a beginner at arpeggios, I recommend putting the metronome at 60 and go 1 note to the beat, then 2 notes to the beat, then 4 notes to the beat. You could even do metronome speeds if you've run into difficulties getting faster, going from 60 to 63 to 66 to 69 if you need the refinement between, you might not need it initially, but you might need it going from 2 notes to 4 notes, for example. But I'm just going to show you a brief recap as to how to practice this. And I'm going to turn the metronome on. I'm not sure what it's set on, but whatever it is, that should work. Now notice a couple of things. First of all, no up and down motion with the arm, just fingers. And I'm using rather raised fingers. The purpose of that is to get the independence of the fingers. Plus, you develop strength by moving your fingers for each note. You get the feel of where each key is. It gives you an opportunity to dig into each note to really feel secure. Once you're secure at that, and you should do that at least 4 times through comfortably, not 4 times where you're the first 2, 3 times it's not quite there. I mean 4 times absolutely solidly in a row before moving on any faster. And then you go to 2 notes to the beat. So you notice as you're getting faster with 2 notes to the beat, the fingers are a little bit closer to the keys. Transitioning to 4 notes to the beat, you want to almost have your arms floating in air just above the keys because the fingers just don't have the strength to support the arms at great speed. So listen to 4 notes to the beat. Notice how there's less motion, just fingers very, very close to the keys. Now, I just did one demonstration of each of them. You will want to spend a great deal of time at each speed level. 1 note to the beat, you might spend, 5 minutes just at one, and 5 minutes doesn't sound very long, but if you're just playing an arpeggio at 1 note to the beat at 60, 5 minutes is a pretty long time. However long it takes, because you'll gain great strength and independence of the fingers. So we've covered really one way of practicing arpeggios, which is essential. I think it's probably one of the best ways to practice arpeggios. But you may get to a stumbling block. You may just get to a point where you can do 1 note, you can do 2 notes, and you get to 4 notes, and it's really hard, and you're wondering, how can I get this any faster? Are there any shortcuts? Well, I'm going to show you a couple. One is to practice with chords. Let me show you how. You notice by delineating where the thumb crossings are and then where the 2 notes play together, you get the sense of where the thumbs have to be. I'm going to do this again for you. And indeed, you can do that at 2 notes to the beat as well. Doing 4 notes would be really tough. It depends what tempo you're at. But you want to get it fluid, so you get the sense of the thumb crossings. Then you, instead of trying to go faster with that, instead break it up with rhythms so that you get the sense of landing on the thumbs in each hand and the inner notes kind of being light, like this. Now, why is this helpful? Because you have to get the sense of the thumbs versus the fingers. The thumb crossings are what enable you to go up and down the keyboard. And so getting anchored on the thumb crossings and having the fingers with evenness to be able to get those inner notes cleanly. So those are 3 ways to practice arpeggios. I would love to hear from people who, I'm sure many of you who have practiced scales and arpeggios have a lot of different techniques. Perhaps you can share in the comments on livingpianos.com or on YouTube. We'd love to hear from you. What is the most difficult scale to play on the piano? And we're going to restrict ourselves just to major scales. And I promise you're going to get an answer by the end of this video that may surprise you. If you're just starting on the piano, it can seem a bit intimidating when you have scales with a lot of sharps, for example. Just being able to figure out the notes is tough, like a B major scale, for example, with 5 sharps. So you figure, how do you negotiate a thing like that? Well, actually, there is something in a B major scale that makes it easier than you might think. It's something referred to as mirror fingering. What is mirror fingering? Mirror fingering is when you're playing your thumb at the same note in both hands. In this case, B and E, the thumbs play, and all the other notes are played with fingers, are black keys. That kind of breaks it down for you. So the E is thumbs in both hands. And once again, the B is thumbs in both hands. And you use fingers for the other notes on the black keys. So actually, B major isn't as hard as you might think. Although, just reading it, if you're a relative beginner, can be daunting. And the other nice thing about B major is the thumbs play just a half step above the preceding black key. You go from D sharp to E, just a half step away, and A sharp to B. So it's relatively easy to do that. Well, let's take an intimidating flat scale like G flat. G flat major, it sounds like this. Now here again you have mirror fingering. There is one slight difference in that the first time the thumbs both play white keys is on C flat, which is a white key in this case. The next time it plays is on F. Now why is that significant? Because the first time the thumbs play, it's a half step above the B flat to C flat. The next time it plays a white key, it's a whole step. So the thumbs have to remember which time they play just a half step above the preceding black key, and which time they play a whole step above the preceding black key. A little bit more complicated, but at least you can anchor your thumbs on the white keys and the fingers play the black keys. Now let's go to another scale that you would think would be easier, and in fact, generally people learn their scales in order of the circle of fifths, starting with scales that have fewer sharps and flats and going to scales with more sharps and flats. But D major I'm going to pick now because D major does not have mirror fingering. That is to say, you do not have the thumbs on white keys and fingers on black keys. There aren't enough black keys to accomplish that. But more than that, the thumbs do play together on D, but then the right-hand thumb plays G, the left-hand thumb plays A. So you do not have that benefit of anchoring the thumbs on the same note in both hands. It actually makes it a little bit more difficult to play, even if it is a bit easier to learn. So once again, you go and the thumb in the right hand is on G, where you have a second finger in the left hand. But then you do land on thumbs in both hands on D, which helps. So now, what is the most difficult scale? Believe it or not, once you learn your scales, they're all about the same difficulty. But there's one that is just a little bit harder than the rest, and that's C major. How could this be? It's the first scale everybody learns. You figure it's easy because it's all white keys. Well, that's exactly why it's the hardest scale to play, because you don't have the benefit of anchoring on black keys. It's just a whole sea of white keys that are not differentiated from one another. And you certainly don't have the benefit either of mirror fingering, because your thumbs, while they both play C, the thumbs come on different notes in the middle of the scale. So C major. The C major scale takes more concentration for an accomplished pianist, because once you learn all your scales, as I said, they're all about the same, but you don't have the benefit of the black keys to guide you. More than that, like D major, you don't have the anchoring of the mirror fingering you do on C. But once you get to F, you've got the thumb in the right hand and the second finger in the left hand, and then G, you got the thumb in the left hand and the second finger in the right hand. So you have the difficulties of D major and other scales that don't have mirror fingering, plus you don't have any black keys to guide you at all. I bet some of you are surprised to learn that the C major is the hardest scale to play, but it's a fact. And that is in regards to major scales. Minor scales are a whole other lesson. And incidentally, if you need fingering for major scales, minor scales, and all your major and minor arpeggios, Hanon 60 Selected Studies for the Virtuoso Pianist is kind of the scale and arpeggio Bible for pianists. It's what the vast majority of pianists use as a reference for fingering of all major and minor scales and arpeggios. Now, there is another school of thought where all the scales are played with mirror fingering. This is not standard, but I understand the logic of it. Love to hear from any of you out there who utilize mirror fingering in all your scales. I never learned them that way. I just kind of like you learn how to type on a keyboard that is not the most ergonomic, but with the letters placed in a kind of random order instead of the ones you use most in the middle, which would be better. But imagine relearning that. It's the same thing with scales. I know my scales and arpeggios. I learned them as a young child, and they're with me for the rest of my life, and I'm not changing now. How do you know what the right fingering is for major scales and arpeggios? Well, this is a great question, and fortunately, there's a resource on the piano. And it's not so easy on other instruments, which I'm going to tell you about briefly, and then we're going to revisit this in just a moment. You know, if you play the violin, there are different fingerings at different schools of thought for the violin on scales. Everybody plays with different fingering concepts. Even on the French horn, which I also play, there's standard fingering, but there are books written about alternate fingerings. Same is true on woodwind instruments. But fortunately on the piano, there is the gospel, and the gospel is Hanon. And the vast majority of people who study the piano use the fingering in Hanon. It's very easy now. So what is fingering all about in scales and arpeggios? Well, simply put, we have only 10 fingers, but the piano, of course, you play up and down the keyboard. Generally speaking, you play scales and arpeggios 4 octaves up and down. So you must have finger crossings. Simply put, your hands are mirror images of one another. So going up, the right hand has thumb crossings, and the left hand has 3rd and 4th finger crossings. Coming down, it's reversed. The right hand has 3rd and 4th finger crossings, and the left hand has thumb crossings. So in each scale, there are 8 fingerings you must memorize. So for example, in the C major scale, the right hand crosses on C and F, because this is how you can get up the whole scale. And so on. The left hand has 3rd finger on A and 4th finger on D. So once you have the first octave, you've got the whole scale ascending. Coming down, the right hand has a 3rd finger crossing on E, a 4th finger on B. The left hand has thumb crossings on G and C. Now, you might think, how am I going to learn all my scales and arpeggios? That's a lot of information. Well, it is, but not as much as you think, because the same patterns that are used in the C major scale are used in a whole bunch of other major and minor scales, like C, G, D, A, and E, all have the same basic patterns. Now, there are some you will have to learn that are fresh, like a B-flat major scale is somewhat unique, although it's similar to E-flat. So there are other similarities along the way. Hanon is the wonderful resource. I'm going to just mention as a footnote, there is a second school of thought that I've never met anybody who uses because it's so unusual, but it's worthy of mentioning this little footnote, which is mirror fingering. Mirror fingering is a whole separate concept of fingering on the piano for scales and arpeggios, which puts the thumb crossing on the same note. The thumb plays the same note in both hands on all the scales and arpeggios. And it's a whole different way of approaching scales and arpeggios. And if any of you study scales and arpeggios with mirror fingering, I'd love to hear from you. I've never talked to anybody who's mastered that technique, and it is not very commonly used. So I'd love to hear from you on that. Today I'm going to give you 3 tips for practicing scales. You know, I've done quite a few videos about scales, and it's a funny thing. Truth be known, I spend the minimal amount of time practicing scales in order to achieve the desired results, which is to have clean finger work and to have mastered all the fingering of all major and minor scales and arpeggios. However, no matter how far you go with scales, you can always go further. It's endless what you can do with scales. Without overwhelming you, today I'm just going to give you 3 tips. Maybe you've gone in a rut, you've practiced your scales, and you don't even know where to go next. Maybe you're not totally happy with your finger work and you're wondering, Is there any other way to practice scales that might enlighten you and help you to clean up your technique? Well, here are 3 that you can try. First of all, most of us practice scales just going up and down the piano in 4 octaves, an octave apart, as referenced in Hannon's 60 selected exercises for the virtuoso pianist. And that is a prerequisite for developing a good technique on the piano, particularly for playing classical styles or anything that's technically oriented. It's kind of like having a bag of tricks in your back pocket that's always there when you need it. Because how often do you have scales in music? Pretty much all the time, in one way or another. So what about practicing with different articulations or phrasings? Instead of playing all legato, you could play like with detached fingers like this. The reason why that's so incredibly important and helpful is that the evenness note to note is not just the down strike of the key, it is the release of each key. In other words, if you were to slow down a sloppy scale performance, you might hear that the notes are striking together, but some notes are just holding longer than others, and you'll hear something like this. Haphazard lengths of notes. More likely where the thumb or finger crossings happen, you might hear something like something of that nature. By being precise with the duration of all the notes, making them all detached, and you can have different levels of detachment. What I did was kind of a staccato fingers, but the notes can actually have a little bit more length than that and still be detached, something like this. Not really staccato fingers, but not smooth and connected the way you might think of playing scales usually. In a recent video, I talked about how playing the hands 2 octaves apart when practicing scales can help you to hear things better. Well, here's another tip for you. Play one hand legato and one hand staccato from the fingers, and wow, can you really hear things. Here, I'll show you what I mean. In that example, I played the right hand legato and the left hand staccato from the fingers. Of course, this can be reversed. This is just the tip of the iceberg. 2-note slurs, 4-note slurs, And that could be reversed. Or 4-note slurs. And you could start on the second note doing the same thing. The whole idea is it helps you to identify where the hands play together. It solidifies your scales in a way that just playing them the same way over and over again is never going to really achieve for you. It could be a tremendous time saver. So what other ideas? That's just one of 3 tips I'll give you today. That's going to keep you busy for the next 6 months, right? The trick is, though, not to necessarily do every articulation in every scale. It's to do what solves problems. If you find you have an unevenness in an F major scale descending, focus in on that and start working on various techniques that solve that problem on that scale. And then you'll find that this technique will translate from one scale to other scales. What about different volumes? We're all used to playing scales, loud, soft, medium. What about playing scales at, very, very loud? or perhaps very delicately. And once again, you can play one hand loud and one hand soft, but it doesn't just have to be that. You can make a crescendo up, a crescendo down. Or you can start at the bottom loud and make a decrescendo all the way up and all the way down. You see, the key is not to look at scales as an abstraction completely, but to put it into musical context. And after all, when you play music, you're not playing everything straight. So you can explore this with your scales and make them more interesting and more musical. Always strive for a beautiful sound at the piano. This is really important in your music anyway. You can also do all these techniques, or many of these techniques, with your arpeggios. Of course, work at different speeds. I am a firm believer of metronome speeds with scales. Very important that you practice your scales slowly and progressively faster using the metronome with 1 or 2 notches at a time. This is what assures really clean, even scales. There's no substitute for that sort of practice. These are tips for those of you who already have scales kind of in your back pocket, but you want to take them to the next level. Here are some musical things you can do with scales at home to enhance your technique on the piano. Maybe you work on scales and arpeggios on a regular basis, or maybe you know you should, but you don't, and you're thinking, is it really that important? Well, I'm going to give you 5 reasons why working on scales and arpeggios is worth your while. Okay, one of the most obvious ones is it improves the evenness in your playing. When you're playing scales, after all, you are focusing on the evenness, the hands being precisely together, the evenness of the sound, the evenness of the release of the notes, all of that. And it gives you that benefit in your playing, because obviously scales are an abstraction. It's not music after all. But if you practice your scales diligently with the metronome, slowly and then increasing the speed until you can play scales rapidly with evenness, think what that does for your playing. What's another benefit? Well, obviously you can develop strength. Why? Well, there's 2 reasons for this. First of all, you will play more notes in a short amount of time when you're working on scales and arpeggios than working on your music, because a lot of your practice of music is a mental exercise. If you're learning a score, you're focusing in on the harmonies, the fingering, you're learning things, and it's a mental effort. When you're working on scales and arpeggios, it's all physical. It's actually, you're obviously paying attention to what you're doing, but the whole time. Slow practice of scales, by the way, unbelievably important. In fact, in some ways, even more important than the rapid, quick practicing of scales, because that's where you really develop the strength. When you're playing, really hammering each note with the fingers, not just using the arms, you don't want to be doing this. Of course, you get a lot of power that way, but try to play fast that way. It can't be done. But if you use each finger, raising the fingers and coming down, it stretches your hands and your fingers so that you can get a nice attack on each note cleanly. Most importantly, the release of previously played notes in scales and arpeggios, so you get the space between the notes being even as well. This is a tremendous way to develop strength for yourself. Of course, another benefit of working on scales is you develop speed in your playing. How this is done, once again, the metronome to the rescue. You work slowly. Now, you may be able to go from 1 note to the beat, as I was demonstrating with that D-flat major arpeggio, to 2 notes to the beat. But going from 2 notes to 4 notes could be too great a leap. So you might want to just do 1 or 2 notches at a time in the metronome. As you're getting faster, you're getting lighter so that you can develop speed. And it's a terrific way to develop speed because you don't have all the complexity of shifting harmonies, inner voices, fingering patterns, phrasing, expression. It's just the abstraction of piano technique. So it's a terrific way to develop speed in your playing. Another benefit, tremendous benefit of knowing all major and minor scales and arpeggios. That's harmonic and melodic minor scales and your major and minor major scales and major and minor arpeggios is for fingering. After all, the vast majority of music you play is built on scales and broken chords. If you know all your scales and arpeggios, when you have them in your music, it's not like something you have to practice. You've already got the technique there. Now you might think, how can you learn all scales and arpeggios? Well, there's a very, very simple way, and that is to just focus on one each week. Spend 5 or 10 minutes a day in your practice. When your mind is tired, you've been learning music, and you're exhausted, you're ready to quit, you think, I don't know if I can do anything more, and you're mentally tired, perfect time for scales or arpeggios. It uses a different part of your concentration so that even though you might be mentally tired from memorizing or working out thorny passages in your music, you go to a scale, you start working on a new fingering. Maybe you've never done the G sharp minor scale before, and there you go. You work it out slowly, and if you do 1 a week, after a year, you'll know all major and minor scales and arpeggios. Now that's not the end, that's the beginning, because then the next year you can start increasing the speed of all of them. And at first, some of them might become more fluent than others. I suggest keeping track with a chart so that you can know which ones need the work and eventually get all your major minor scales and arpeggios at a certain speed, and then notch that up and notch it up again. And it's a never-ending process. And there are many other ways you can practice scales and arpeggios, contrary motion, in intervals. But first order of business, just learn all of them. It's not a big deal. 5 or 10 minutes a day, do it consistently. It will really help your playing. And the last benefit that I'm offering, there are actually many more benefits, but these are 5 really definite benefits, is it improves your reading of music. How come? Because when you're reading a score, if there's scale passages and arpeggios, you don't have to figure it out. You already know how to play them. So the fingering becomes obvious. These passages become fluid for you. So these are 5 really treasures worth your 5 or 10 minutes a day. Once again, it improves your evenness, develops your strength, increases your speed, helps you with fingering, and improves your reading. So if you haven't been doing scales and arpeggios on a regular basis, what are you waiting for? Like I said, you don't have to spend hours a day doing it, just a little bit of time each day. When you're tired of working on other things, add this to your regimen. I promise you will get benefits. Any of you who have worked on scales and arpeggios, want to share your experiences, what it's done to your playing, in the comments here at livingpianos.com. I have a number of videos on arpeggios, and just a quick primer. What makes arpeggios so difficult, even compared to scales, which have 3rd and 4th finger crossings as well as thumb crossings, arpeggios can be even more difficult because your thumb in particular and your 3rd finger has to cross so far over, or your 4th fingers sometimes, and it makes it difficult. So the way to practice this, as I've shown, is have the metronome set at a slow speed and practice preparing your thumb as early as possible, which means right when the 2nd finger plays, the thumb tucks under. So instead of waiting until the thumb needs to play like this, you instead prepare the thumb when the 2nd finger plays. Right after the thumb releases, it tucks under. So you train your hand to prepare the thumb early like this. And the left hand does exactly the same thing coming down. So that is an essential technique, and practicing without moving your arms up and down, depend upon your finger strength, work with the metronome slowly a great deal, then increase the speed to get it to 2 notes and eventually 4 notes to the beat. You might have to do metronome speeds to get it that fast. And there's other techniques I've shown. You can play the 2 notes in the middle, like this. And you can do rhythms as well. There are countless ways to practice arpeggios, but today I'm going to show you an essential technique, which is the rotation of the hand. You don't want to have an abrupt crossing of the thumb or your fingers at the point at which they cross over, so you want to avoid this. Now, naturally, preparing the thumb early is a great way to avoid that, but there's more to it, because no matter how much you tuck your thumb under, you notice it's not all the way to where it needs to go from a G to a C. That's really far. So notice how my hand is slightly this way instead of this way. I start off with a thumb like this, but by the time I get here, the hand rotates slightly. And it's important that it be a smooth motion, not a jerky one. And this allows for playing fluid, fast arpeggios. Practicing slowly, preparing the thumb in advance, and eventually get to the point where you're rotating the hand slightly in a smooth manner. So that is the rotation of the hands in arpeggios. You'll find, by the way, in scales too, not so much because you don't have nearly as far a reach, but there are many places in music with broken chords of different sorts where this rotation of the hand is really important. It also comes into play in being able to delegate the weight of the hand for balance, which is a subject for another video. Today the subject is why you must be able to play your scales on autopilot. Now, what am I talking about? Autopilot. Well, there's something that I've talked about in the past of motor memory or tactile memory, and while this is oftentimes a dangerous thing to rely upon in your piano playing, because you can take a wrong turn here or there if your mind isn't cognizant of where you are in a composition with repeats, expositions, developments, changes of keys, you must have an intellect about your music. Otherwise, as I said, you can end up in the wrong place in the middle of a piece. But why is it you absolutely have to be able to play with just motor memory in your scales? Well, it's because of the fingering crossings. Scales encompass thumb crossings in the right hand going up, and with the left hand going down. And of course you have third and fourth finger crossings in the left hand going up and in the right hand going down. Third, fourth, third, and in the right hand coming down. Third finger crossing, and then the fourth finger crossing. So they keep alternating, third, fourth, third, fourth. All major scales and minor scales have the same basic premise of third and fourth finger crossings in one hand going up, the other hand going down, and thumb crossings in one hand going on, the other hand going up, and the other hand going down. That's a whole lot of stuff to remember. That's why in the early years of study, rather than working on scales which have this complicated fingering to learn, just to get the sense of playing keys, which is basically the whole idea of practicing scales, is to develop fluid notes in a row so that you can play beautiful streams of notes with evenness, with jewel-like precision of the notes, of the space between the notes, the volume of the notes, an evenness and a clarity. What if you can't get this fingering? Well, that's why I love to start students with the very first exercises in Hanon, which have more and more different patterns, but none of them involve finger crossings, like the first Hanon exercise. And then for the top. And then there's other patterns. You get the idea. So you get to work out your fingers, develop strength and fluidity and speed, all without worrying about the complexity of these finger crossings. Now, why do they have to be an automatic pilot? Because you think about when you play a scale, and you're playing a fast scale, there just isn't time to think of those fingerings. How can you think of a thumb crossing here and a third and fourth finger crossing there? You can't think of all of that. You have to be able to just do it without thinking about the actual fingering, so you can focus on the sound, you can focus on the expression, the volume, the evenness, the clarity, without thinking about the fingering. I had a video a few weeks ago you might have seen on how playing the piano is like walking or learning how to walk. At the beginning, it's a struggle. If you've ever watched a toddler taking their first steps, the concentration on their faces is unbelievable as they figure out how to traverse one step to the next. You know, being upright, we don't think about it because we walk on automatic pilot. Imagine if every time you had to take a step, you had to think about what's involved. All the coordination, all the muscles, the foot muscles, the leg muscles, all of it. Keep your body upright. It would be almost impossible to do anything while walking. Yet we walk all the time and don't even think about it. That's exactly what you must do with your scales. Now, how do you get to that point? Well, first of all, you should only start scales when you have some strength in your fingers. If you're just starting out, learning scales and just doing scales in an octave or 2 octaves is really not as great value. You really want to play all your scales in 4 octaves right from the get-go. Because even though the fingering is the same, you figure, well, if I can do it in this octave, why do I have to do it in that octave? Well, the reason is that, you know, when you're down here, the angle of your arms is quite different from up here. It feels very different here than it does here. So you must get used to playing the whole keyboard. So if you're not really up for that challenge yet, you're better off doing maybe 5 or 10 Hanon exercises. Get your fingers strong, get fluidity so you can play them, you know, start with 1 note to the beat so you can really see how your fingers are working, then 2 notes to the beat, working with a metronome, and then finally 4 notes to the beat. And do a whole bunch of these Hanon exercises until you can play them in a fluid manner with strength, with evenness. Then you are ready to embark upon scales. And that's when you work on them exactly the same way. Work on them in 4 octaves, just like in Hanon 60 selected studies for the virtuoso pianist, which is actually the Bible, or like the Bible of scales and arpeggios, because it has all the standard fingering that 99% of pianists utilize. So I recommend that highly. Get to the point where you can play your scales without thinking about the fingering. And then when you have scale passages in music, you don't have to start practicing that like it's a fresh thing. It's already there, literally at your fingertips. Why you must practice your scales and arpeggios in 4 octaves. You know, you play your scales, you think it's the same thing over and over again, and if you could play it in a lower octave, you know, you could play it in the middle, you should be the same thing playing it anywhere. But it really isn't. And the reason for it is watch what happens when you're playing down here or up here. The angle of the hands, they shift. Do you see this angle of my... So you really... You need to gain the fluency going up and down the keyboard. Now, the way to do this is, first of all, make sure you're sitting properly. If you're sitting too close, watch what happens to this angle now. This gets really tough to get this angle when you're sitting too close. And a good key is be back so that you can have your hands straight out. And then it's so much easier to go from one side of the keyboard to the other. You know, so many times I see students and they'll slide on the bench to the left and the right. Well, that's really good, but what happens when you're going from the left to the right? You're going to be sliding back and forth like that? There's so much music that goes back and forth. You need to find a center point in the bench where you're comfortable, sitting at the right height, the right distance, then you have half a chance. Then practice your scales. Start with a comfortable tempo, using the metronome, as always with scales and arpeggios, to measure your work. And go through the full 4 octaves in all major and minor scales and arpeggios. And don't be intimidated by it. It might seem like a lot, but it really isn't. If you just take 1 a week, you'll get them all eventually. What's the rush? You got your whole life to enjoy the piano. And I guarantee, for those of you who have learned all the scales and arpeggios, what it has done for your technique and the ease in which you can play music and read music, having those fundamental techniques under your belt. Leave it here in the comments at livingpianos.com and YouTube. And for those of you who are on the journey expanding, get enlightenment and encouragement and motivation from the people who have done it, because I can tell you it is a game changer for you. So in the piece of music, what are pieces of music but scales and arpeggios, chords? It gives you such a solid foundation and a leg up that you don't have to practice every time you have a scale or an arpeggio and a piece of music. You already know them. And so much music is comprised of this. Play them in all the octaves, and you will be rewarded with a fluency and an ease of the piano that will transcend the work you've put into it. You're going to get much more out of it than you could ever believe. This is livingpianos.com. Today is the secret of the thumbs in arpeggios. Arpeggios, you know what they are. So what are they about? You know, how do you do that? You know, scales are hard enough with the thumb crossings, but with arpeggios is a secret to achieving smooth thumb crossings. You know, you've got, in the left hand, you've got fourth finger crossings, generally, sometimes third fingers. But coming down in the left hand or going up in the right hand, you have thumb crossings. Now, this is what I see so many students doing with their thumbs. And it's not so much the thumbs, it's my elbow. Watch my elbow. Now, what happens when you go fast? There's no way it's going to work. So what a lot of people think to do is, reach with a thumb. But you know what? That's too late. The secret is tuck the thumb under when you play the second finger. That's right. The second finger plays, the thumb tucks under. Watch. It's already ready for the C coming. And the left hand coming down does the same thing. You don't want to wait it's already too late there. So you tuck the thumb right when you play the second finger. Then, for the first time, you don't have to do this with the elbow going in and out. You prepare way in advance, and that slow practice of stretching that thumb under right when you play the second finger is the secret for getting smooth thumb crossings in your arpeggios. If you've never tried this before, try it. Work slowly first. I suggest 60 at one note to the beat, because you have to train your hand to do this. It's not going to do it automatically. But once it does become automatic, wow, you're going to get smoothness and speed out of arpeggios like you've never had before. Try it out and see how that works for you. This is a really important tip for you. Let me know how it works for you in the comments on livingpianos.com and on YouTube. This is an exercise that I learned in college, in conservatory, and it's a great way to build strength. I'm going to share it with you now. You know, sometimes you don't have a lot of time to practice, but you want to get the maximum amount of strength to be built in your technique. So you want something that's going to really exercise you much more thoroughly than repertoire or even scales and arpeggios. And maybe you don't want to learn a whole etude of notes that are hard to figure out. So this is an exercise that's all based upon a pattern of chords. It goes from a major triad to a minor triad to a diminished triad to an augmented triad. If you don't know what these terms mean, there'll be future videos explaining exactly what they are, but we're going to have the notes for you here so you can figure it out. So we start off, and it's the notes of the triad in both hands. So we're going to start in C major. So there's a C major triad. But we just start with the top two notes in the right hand and the bottom two notes in the left hand, and then you go back and forth through the scale notes. Notice how you use all 5 fingers, and the independence of the fingers is critical here. After you do the major, then you do the same thing in the minor, which just has one different note. The E goes down to E flat. Then we go to the diminished. You add one more flat. The G becomes G flat, and you keep the E flat. And finally, the augmented, where everything changes. You start with, like you were starting from the beginning, except with not C, E, G, but C, E, G sharp. Notice that's all whole tones, all whole steps. You do this in every single key. So you start in C, then you go to C sharp, then D, so it just goes on and on. You get the idea. Here's the great thing. The whole exercise just takes a couple of minutes, 3 minutes or something to go through all the keys. But boy, is it a workout. And better than that, it's all fingers. And the independence of the fingers is strengthened, and you build strength. It's not in an outstretched position. And since there's nothing with any phrasing or dynamics, you can focus solely on your finger motion. It's strictly an exercise, not a piece of music. Easy to learn, because once you figure out the very beginning, you just transpose it up a half step again and again until you get back to C on the top octave. Try this exercise. You'll develop a lot of strength. I hope you enjoy this. Thanks a lot. This, once again, Robert Estrin here at livingpianos.com.